All right, so here in this video, we return once again to the notion that academic language tends to be highly formulaic. The academic genre is highly formulaic, and so we can use this to our advantage when writing a research article. So there are, broadly speaking, 6 common ingredients or elements that one encounters in the discussion section when one discusses results. And if these are missing, or if all of them are missing, certainly um, it looks like the author hasn't really done their job as in terms of discussing the results. So I'm going to use a number of symbols here to help visualize this. One is um, recapping points raised earlier, either in the method and or in the discussion, um, picking up on elements that were introduced and how they influence the results. So revisiting points raised in the intro or results. Not just recapping the results, which is unfortunately what happens in many cases. Another important dynamic that happens is discussing what your results mean and how they converse with other studies. And this is different from the introduction. The introduction, you use the literature, a published body of literature, to help you justify your study or your research. Then in the discussion section, you use another body of literature usually to justify and make meaning of your results. Although sometimes the same authors that were brought up in the introduction can be used there. So comparing with other studies. Then an expansion or elaboration or extrapolation of what your results mean is often a main component of the discussion section. This means it kind of explaining or elaborating on what your results mean, what they imply, basically building on the results, moving beyond just representing the results per se, and explaining, extrapolating. This little wrench here it represents how authors at this stage of the article will talk about the applications or the implications, the practical part of the result. So after you come to your results, what do they mean in the real world? What implication or applications do they have? And this symbol here represents how it's like the author putting the foot on the brake pedal. And this is very important because too many authors don't do this, and it doesn't look good, which is not overstating the importance of your result, instead going the other way and saying, okay, well, all of this is good, all these results are interesting, but let's look at this carefully because, well, and then, for example, this is a small sample size, or this only refers to this particular population, or more studies are needed, and so on. So this is talking about the limitations of the study. Is a very important element in the discussion section. And then finally, a lot of discussion sections end with this, which is talking about future directions. What questions still remain? What do you recommend for further pursuit of the question that you tried to answer? So talk about how the study advances the area, what the contribution is in terms of advancing the area that you talked about, but what is still needed. And this sequence here it pretty much follows a typical, of course, you see a lot of variation, sequence in which these things appear in the discussion, where you often see first authors revisiting points raised, then comparing with other studies, then expanding, and then talking about practical applications, talk about limitations, and then ending with this kind of view to the future. It's very rare that one starts off with talking about the limitations, although that happens. Um, it's rare that they talk about the practical implications at the beginning. Um, it, but this, just to give you an idea, these are all the main things, and if you consider these things and the extent to which they apply to your research, and how they and if they're relevant to your study, then do consider putting them in the discussion section. So we've seen this article before, this quantifying the burden of research articles in a second language, data from Mexican sciences. So you remember the introduction, right? And these points here, the the fact that there's a lot of research that's published in English, and there's an increase among non-native speakers, but if there's a greater burden for those authors because they don't speak English as a first language when they write research articles, that's an open question. So that's what they write here, is open question. And they try to answer that question through the data. And these issues are then taken up again, that were brought up in the territory, which is this number one move, and then in the niche, and then occupying the niche. Those things are not just left in the introduction. There's a purpose for these elements, which was signaled, of course, by this open question mark, and that marks what they intend to research. And so in the discussion section is where they start, right here, this section that marks the discussion. They start with revisiting the points raised. So the purpose of this investigation was to provide quantifiable data through which the perceived burden of writing a research article in English as a second language could be established. So that reflects the open question. They said this is an open question. That was their niche. And then that's picked up again as the first sentence in the discussion. So this is kind of the analog of the claiming centrality. In the beginning, in introduction, authors often claim centrality, stating what the general importance is of the research. And in the discussion, they often start with the second thing, which is the move to, picking that up again, which is basically what the main purpose of the article was, what the contribution was. And so that's basically all of this here is a recap of that. All right. Then the authors expand and they extrapolate, explain, extrapolate. So here they start talking about the data. The data in the study differentiate between the disciplinary and linguistic aspects of the previously reported difficulties and support the idea that the added burden of second language science writing is linguistic in nature. So basically supporting their hypothesis. As the participants in this study responded in parallel questions to the perceived difficulty, anxiety, and dissatisfaction of writing in their first and second languages, any differences found can be related to the factor of their perceptions of writing in a second language. In other words, as the disciplinary function of writing a science article is consistent between both questions, it is unlikely that this is the factor that contributed to added burden found in the responses of the scientists concerning their second language science writing. So in the results section, they presented their results, obviously and statistics, they put up numbers. But then they explain what those mean, and one key phrase here is this, in other words. This is them explaining to the reader what their data mean. In other words, this is what our data mean, they're saying. In other words, the disciplinary function of writing a science article is consistent between both questions. It is unlikely that this is the factor that contributed to added burden. And notice now, and we're going to pick this up again in the next module, how they're careful about, they're hedging a little bit here. In other words, it is unlikely, not telling you definitely not, but they're making an assertion here based on the data, and they're expanding, they're explaining what those mean and what the statistics mean, how they can be confident in what the meaning that those results are meaningful. They also do this, the comparison with other studies. These findings support the qualitative data presented by other researchers, so they're kind of a nod to other people. The difficulties faced by second language scientists, such as those summarized by Usener and Flowerdew and Lees, St. John and Saliger-Meyer, can be attributed to linguistic difficulties as a result of working in a second language. Qualitative research with non-Anglophone scholars report greater difficulty in writing quickly, writing appropriately, accessing up-to-date resources, and accessing the networks that facilitate English language publication. What the current study does is to assign these difficulties clearly to the linguistic component and specify the self-reported and perceived degree of increased burden while supporting the underlying findings of previous studies that English science writing involves difficulty. So basically what they're saying is this was all kind of said before in different ways by the other people, acknowledging them, thus supporting what they said. These names, a lot of them were brought up in the introduction. But then they also add, and it's kind of like a sub-move to in the discussion, saying that, well, what the current study does, or another word you can put here is the word that adds, is that they assign these difficulties to the linguistic component specifically. So it supports what has been said before, but with more empirical data. They also talk about how the study advances the area and talk about what is still needed. So on a different level, this study also deepens our understanding of the affective dimension of scientific writing. So this is how this furthers the research area. Previous research has addressed this to a limited extent. So kind of like another move to here. Sending a manuscript out for peer review always carries some level of anxiety. All articles are manifestly riddled with emotions and emotional risk because work is received within a context not only of intellectual but also emotional acceptance and rejection. And we're going to pick this up, this last point, by the way, we're going to pick up on again in the last module. Anxiety is mentioned in some studies, including autobiographical accounts of scholarly publishing. As with other results, the findings of the current study differentiate between disciplinary anxiety and anxiety caused by writing science in a second language. The scientists in this current study report that they do not experience anxiety when writing in their first language, 3.07 on the 7-point scale, but that anxiety jumps to 21% when writing in a second language. So they're kind of recapping what they said, but in this context of affect. So how this advances the area in the affective dimension. And then they talk about limitations. An obvious limitation of the current study is that it focuses on scientists only in Mexico. While the population explored in this study does represent a range of scientific fields and scientists, the fact that they come from Mexico and they speak Spanish may have influenced the results. In this sense, the findings are limited to the self-reported and perceived burden of Mexican scientists and perhaps not to all scientists writing in a second language. Accordingly, it would be very helpful if we had similar data that address scientists from a much wider range of countries. It would be especially useful if that same tool were used, which would allow comparable data to emerge. So this is them, simultaneously saying there is a limitation. They're kind of hinting that the results still may apply to other contexts. And they're also pointing to the direction of other research in the very last sentence or the very last two sentences that they talk about, which may then either some researchers do this to justify a future publication, or simply just to honestly say there's more that could be researched, and this is what's needed to do it. So, I mean, one thing that's important to point out is that so many researchers think that it's wrong to talk about limitations. As I've mentioned before, if you're talking about your baby, your thesis, your dissertation, often it's hard to think about your baby having defects, having limitations. But limitations is not the same thing as defects. There is no such thing as a perfect study. All studies have some limitation to them. They cannot be generalized to the entire planet. And it's important to make sure that you express that to the reader, or else the reviewer will insert that in for you, and you don't want that to happen. So, and we're going to pick this up again in the next module as well about how you can do that. So that's it. Those are the six common elements. You have lots of examples of discussions that don't have all of these, and they may not be relevant for all of you. But now you know some ingredients to make your chili more delicious, basically. And,